The family that seemed peaceful. In a picturesque town nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina, there stood a small white-painted house with a wraparound porch, complete with a swing that creaked softly in the wind. The Parker family lived here, a unit small enough to blend seamlessly into the tranquil rhythm of the rural community. Their life, on the surface, seemed the stuff of glossy home and garden magazines. Tim Parker, a hard-working furniture craftsman in his mid-30s, often spent his weekends fixing up the backyard or chatting with neighbors over a beer. His young daughter Lily, 5 years old, loved doodling pictures of the birds perched on their picket fence. And then, there was Emily, Tim's new wife, with her shy smile and small-town charm, who had recently become the homemaker everyone in town whispered perfect wife material about. The town adored the Parkers, or perhaps what they thought they knew of them. Tim was something of a local celebrity for his craftsmanship. His furniture graced several church halls and mayor's offices across the state, while Emily, with her soft-spoken demeanor, seemed to be the crowning piece of his American dream. Emily was originally just a waitress in a roadside diner that some might pass and forget. But when Tim walked into that diner months ago, dressed in a neatly pressed plaid shirt and his easy, lopsided grin, everything changed for her. It was a whirlwind romance. In the kind of story people in town-type America love to talk about, Tim swept Emily off her feet, seating her in the passenger seat of his Dodge Ram, and later accessorizing her life with new routines. Their neighbors, sensing a fairy tale unfolding 2 doors down, didn't think to wonder about the details. They didn't ask why Emily, barely out of high school, left behind her plans for college to marry a man almost twice her age. They didn't ask why she often looked more fragile than cheerful despite being newly married, the kind of fragility you wouldn't notice unless you stared longer than polite. And they didn't ask much about Lily, Tim's daughter from his previous marriage, a sweet child with striking amber eyes and an air of solemnity unusual for a girl her age. While the media and town's gossip machinery would later sensationalize the unraveling of this family's peaceful facade. To anyone walking by that white picket-fenced house, life inside seemed pretty close to idyllic. However, as peaceful as it appeared on the surface, the shadows inside grew darker with each passing day. The past and background of Emily Johnson grew up in the small, rural town of Marion, South Carolina. One of those places where everyone knows each other, and secrets seldom remain hidden for long. Life in Marion moved at a slow, steady pace where farmers worked dawn to dusk, and children spent their afternoons climbing trees or chasing fireflies. Emily's family, however, often struggled just to get by. Her father, Larry Johnson, managed a modest corn farm that barely yielded enough to cover the bills during bad seasons, and her mother, Cheryl, worked part-time at the local laundromat. Together, they raised Emily to be a kind-hearted, hard-working girl, though life often left her feeling overshadowed by the weight of her family's struggles. Emily was the youngest of 3 siblings and also the quietest. Her older brothers, Matt and Kenny, could often be found tinkering with engine parts in their father's crumbling barn, hoping to someday turn their skills into a proper business. Meanwhile, Emily spent her days helping her mama hang clothes on the line, balancing her part-time babysitting gigs, and folding dog-eared pages in the thrift store romance novels she loved devouring. She wasn't particularly remarkable in the eyes of others, just another charming, fresh-faced girl trying to make her way through a sleepy southern town. But the truth is, Emily had dreams that extended far beyond Marion's dusty 2-lane roads. She was one of those quiet dreamers, the kind who didn't speak much about their aspirations but carried them around like her most precious secret. For Emily, her dream was college. To leave Marion, become a teacher or a writer, maybe even sip coffee in one of those cafes in Charleston she'd only seen on TV. She used to imagine these things while lying in her twin bed, staring at her chipped ceiling, her head full of possibilities. Yet in a town like Marion, dreams often came second to the hard, sobering reality of having to survive. After high school, reality struck when her parents sat her down to talk. College wasn't in the cards. The Johnson farm had seen its worst yields in years, and they just couldn't afford it. Emily didn't protest, she rarely did, but a part of her broke that day. Instead of leaving Marion, she found herself working double shifts at Mama Sue's Diner, the same greasy spoon restaurant she'd frequented with her family growing up. Wiping down tables and serving endless cups of black coffee wasn't what she had pictured for herself, but Emily, being Emily, tried her best to see the silver lining. And then, as life often does, everything changed on a random Saturday in late March when Tim Parker walked into Mama Sue's. At first, Emily barely gave him a second glance, just another customer in paint-stained jeans and broad shoulders, probably stopping by after a long day of work. But he noticed her. Tim wasn't like the other men who wandered into the diner, those who left greasy tips and kept their wedding rings conveniently tucked in their pockets. No, Tim was polite, confident and honest, chatting with her in a way that felt disarming, almost comforting. "You ever think about getting out of here?" he asked her one day while scribbling on his tip receipt. Emily laughed nervously. "Doesn't everyone?" "Maybe I can help you with that," Tim said, flashing a crooked grin that she would later say, messed her up for life. Over the following months, Tim's visits to the diner became more frequent. He'd request to sit at Emily's section, bring her small gifts like daisies wrapped in napkins, and eventually ask her out on a proper date. And while Tim was older, nearly twice her age, he made Emily feel seen in a way she never had before. For the first time, she wasn't just a waitress stuck in Marion. She was someone deserving of attention, of love, of a life she thought had passed her by. The whirlwind romance reached its peak when Tim proposed just a few months later. He painted her a picture of a better life, one where she wouldn't have to scrape by waiting tables or fold laundry for a few extra bucks. He spoke of building a family together, showing her new places, and living a life far away from the struggles of Marion. Against the cautious advice of her parents, Emily said yes. This was her chance at a fairy tale ending, even if it meant leaving behind that tiny flicker of hope she'd once had to make something of herself on her own. As she packed her hand-me-down suitcase and headed toward Tim's pickup truck on that warm July evening, Emily told herself she was stepping into a brighter future. She saw her parents' concerned faces as she waved goodbye, but brushed the thought off. After all, this was love, wasn't it? She didn't realize that the life waiting for her inside Tim's white picket-fenced house would turn out far different from anything her teenage heart could have imagined. The marriage overshadowed by pressure. When Emily stepped into Tim Parker's house with her suitcase still smelling faintly of her parents' attic, she thought she was entering the beginning of something magical, the freedom she'd longed for, her own version of adulthood, a love story that promised happiness. But the reality hit her like a gust of icy wind the day she realized that her new house wasn't just a dreamy family home, it was also a haven of unresolved tension. From the outside, their home looked idyllic, with its white picket fence and freshly mowed lawn. Inside, however, the beautiful facade began to crack, revealing layers Emily hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't just her youth working against her. Barely out of high school, she didn't have the maturity or experience to navigate the complexities of instant motherhood. And Lily, Tim's 5-year-old daughter from his first marriage, wasn't just an average child. She required more attention, more care, more everything. Lily had been diagnosed with autism a year before Emily came into the picture. While she was verbal to a degree, communication was often strained, and her sudden outbursts or rigid routines turned everyday situations into challenges. At first, Emily approached the role of mothering Lily with optimism. She figured it would be tough, but doable, much like babysitting had been back in Marion, but caring for Lily was no ordinary task. The child refused to connect with Emily and greeted her attempts to bond with cold, wary eyes. "She'll warm up," Tim said once. But weeks turned into months, and Lily's walls only seemed to tower higher. There were routines Emily had to follow like clockwork, the blue spoon for breakfast, not the green one. The bedtime stories read in a particular chair, with a specific stuffed animal present. Forgetting one small detail could send Lily into an hour-long meltdown that left Emily emotionally exhausted. More than once Emily found herself crying in the bathroom after one of Lily's tantrums, wondering why she wasn't enough. The pressure deepened with Tim's absence. As a furniture craftsman, he worked long hours, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. On weekends he had clients to visit, designs to finish, and business meetings to attend. He was loving on the occasions when he was home, planting a tired kiss on Emily's forehead and thanking her for holding down the fort, but his presence wore thin in the fabric of her daily life. Most of the time, Emily felt like she was raising Lily on her own, and to a young woman who had dreamed of a partnership steeped in love, that loneliness was suffocating. And then there was the ghost of Tim's first marriage, an unspoken barrier that made Emily feel like a visitor rather than equal partners in the home. Pictures of Lily's mother still hung on the living room wall, small but noticeable, a glimpse of another life that made Emily feel like she was intruding. Neighbors with their overly friendly smiles never hesitated to mention how much of a fighter Tim's ex-wife had been for Lily, how devoted she was before the divorce. It made Emily wonder if she was being compared, if her youth translated to incompetence in their eyes. But even Tim failed to notice her growing unease. On one particular day, as Emily sat at the kitchen counter folding laundry, Lily threw an entire glass of milk onto the floor because it wasn't in her favorite cup. Tim walked in, glanced at the mess, and immediately kneeled down to soothe Lily. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he cooed, fetching her the correct cup, while Emily stood frozen in frustration. "No, thank you," for Emily. "No, babe, let me help you with that." It was always about Lily. "I feel like I don't matter to you," Emily blurted out later that evening when Tim was finally home. He looked surprised, even hurt. "That's not true, Em. Lily just needs more right now." "When? When will I matter? When she turns 10, 15? Or when she finally decides I'm not just the lady who babysits her every day?" Her voice cracked. "Emily, I'm doing my best. This is what being a parent is. You'll see when we have kids of our own." And there it was again. When we have kids of our own. Like an empty promise Tim threw out whenever he sensed she was reaching her breaking point. But that day, Emily wasn't satisfied with hypotheticals. She wanted someone to notice how much she had sacrificed just to be there. She wanted Tim to see her, not just her labor. Even love began to feel transactional, an obligation sandwiched between Tim's work schedules and Lily's demands. On nights when Tim returned home late, Emily would sit alone on their bed in a house that often felt like a cavern, scrolling through her phone for pictures of her old life. Pictures of Marion, her parents' farm, and grainy snapshots of her friends hanging out on summer nights while they planned school dances or joked about their college dreams. She had married to escape loneliness. Now, her marriage made her lonelier than ever. The moments of reprieve when Emily leaned against Tim's shoulder or shared a late-night laugh after Lily had gone to bed were a balm but temporary. Most of her time was consumed by diapers, tantrums, and quiet resentment that stuck to her like wet clothes after a storm. They rarely went out as a couple. Birthdays and anniversaries passed with little fanfare because Lily doesn't do well in crowds. "We can't leave her with the sitter. Next time, babe, I promise." It wasn't outright neglect, but it was enough to feel raw. Like walking barefoot on gravel, day in and day out. Emily found herself asking questions she hadn't dared to voice. Had she made a mistake? Was love enough to overlook everything she had given up? Her freedom, her future? How much longer could she remain in a marriage where she felt more like a background character than a partner? Slowly, the cracks in their marriage began to widen. And beneath the surface of what appeared to be a picturesque family ready to grace the cover of Southern living, shadows stirred, growing darker with every unsaid word and bottled frustration. Lingering tensions in the family. At first, the Parker family's life had a kind of rhythm, however imperfect. Emily did her best to settle into her role as a stepmother while managing the house and making dinners that Tim would praise between mouthfuls. But beneath that veneer of domestic harmony, a quiet tension began to take root. One that would grow deeper with time, like a hairline crack in a foundation that eventually splits a house wide open. One of the biggest sources of tension revolved around Lily. As much as Emily tried to connect with Tim's daughter, there always seemed to be a chasm between them, wide and unbridgeable. Lily rarely looked her in the eye for more than a few seconds and avoided physical affection, shuffling away if Emily tried to hug her. The rejection wasn't deliberate. Emily learned through research about autism that these behaviors were natural for children like Lily. But that didn't make it easier to swallow. Even within the small home, the presence of Tim's first wife lingered like a shadow. Visitors to the Parker home couldn't miss the small photo frames resting on the fireplace mantel, or the framed portrait of Lily with her mother hanging in the hallway. It stared back at Emily every day, silently reminding her of a version of this family that she didn't belong to. Tim assured her it wasn't intentional. "I just haven't gotten around to taking them down," he'd say whenever the topic came up. But after months of waiting, Emily stopped believing the excuse. "She's still part of Lily's life, you know," Tim remarked offhandedly one evening while washing dishes. "I promised her we'd keep some reminders for Lily's sake." Emily, folding a dish towel, hardly nodded. "And what about me? Where's my spot in this family?" Tim's silence wasn't malicious, he simply didn't have an answer. The cracks widened in smaller, less obvious ways too, like the sharp difference in how Tim treated Emily and Lily. He reserved all his patience for his daughter, spending hours navigating around her outbursts with a calm, soothing voice, but with Emily the same calm often ran out fast. "Em, she's just a kid," he'd scold whenever Emily vented her frustrations. "You have to remember she's not doing any of this on purpose." "I know that, Tim, but does it ever occur to you that I'm trying my best too, that maybe I'm struggling to keep all of this together, she'd reply, her brows furrowed in hurt. More often than not, these moments ended with Tim retreating to his workshop, leaving Emily fuming in the kitchen or the living room, where she often sat staring out the window until the tension cooled. Then, there were the neighbors. On the quiet, tree-lined street where the Parkers lived, neighbors were quick to stop by for small talk, casserole dishes in hand, and plenty of opinions on life. While they treated Emily kindly enough, they always seemed to drop subtle hints that she was stepping into another woman's shoes that she could never quite fill. Tim's first wife, now she was something, Mrs. Haywood, their neighbor 3 houses down, would say with a knowing smile. You've got big shoes to fill, sweetie, but I'm sure you'll do just fine. Her words stung, syrupy sweet but barbed, like a compliment wrapped in nettles. The unease wasn't just one-sided. Lily's attachment to her father was equally painful for Emily. The girl clung to Tim in a way that made him unavailable for everything else. Emily couldn't help but feel shut out, like a third wheel in her own home. Family dinners often felt more like Tim and Lily sharing private jokes between mouthfuls of macaroni while Emily sat quietly, picking at her food. Trying to join their laughter felt like crashing a party where you weren't actually invited. One winter night an argument erupted over, of all things, a bedtime routine. Lily had refused to brush her teeth, insisting she wanted her father to read her a bedtime story before bed instead of Emily. Tim, already exhausted from a long day, obliged without much thought, but to Emily, standing alone in the bathroom with a toothbrush Lily had thrown on the floor, it wasn't just about a child's defiance, it was another reminder of how little space she truly occupied in her own family. It's not about the toothbrush, Tim, Emily said later that evening as she paced in their bedroom. It's about the fact that I'm not really part of this family. I feel like I'm just the help around here. Tim ran a hand through his hair, his patience thinning. That's not fair, Emily. You're making this harder on yourself than it needs to be. Harder? Harder? She burst out. I left my family, my hometown, my entire life for this. For you! Do you even realize what kind of pressure I'm under? Lily sees me as an intruder, and sometimes you make me feel like one too. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Tim didn't argue back this time. It wasn't that he didn't care. Perhaps he cared too much but didn't know how to fix the ever-growing fracture left by their circumstances. Beyond the walls of their home, Emily's sense of isolation only grew stronger. She thought about the life she'd left behind in Marion, friends she'd lost touch with, the mundane comfort of her parents' house, and the unfulfilled dream of college. Late at night, while Tim and Lily slept, she'd scroll through her phone, looking at photos of her hometown or old pictures she and Tim had taken during their short courtship. Those images now felt like artifacts of a different lifetime, blurry and impossible to reclaim. Inside the Parker home, Emily tried to mask her struggles beneath the surface, painting on a smile for Lily's teachers during school pickups, or forcing laughter at neighborhood gatherings. But day by day, her patience wore thinner, her hope for the future dimmed. It wasn't the big fights but rather the small, everyday omissions that stung the most. Forgotten apologies, moments of affection lost to Lily's demands, and an ever-present sense that no matter how hard Emily tried, she'd always be second, both to Tim's past and to his daughter's future. Slowly but surely, anger began to fester alongside her loneliness. Where compassion once lived in Emily's heart, resentment began building walls of its own, and the longer she sat with her feelings unspoken, the heavier they became, suffocating her under the weight of unmet expectations and desperate longing. The cracks between them deepened with every passing day until the once picturesque image of the Parker family barely resembled the warmth it pretended to project from the outside. The tension reaches its peak. By the time Emily realized how deeply unhappy she had become, the tension in the Parker household was no longer something she could ignore. It had transformed from an occasional ache to a constant suffocating presence. Every corner of the house seemed to radiate it, the strained smiles at the breakfast table, the unsaid words, and the ever-widening chasm between her and Tim. Their once playful banter had been replaced by curt exchanges, spoken with the civility of strangers or people too tired to fight anymore. Emily felt it more acutely than ever. She had tried, she had given everything, her time, her youth, her aspirations, to build this family, but every brick she added seemed to sink into a foundation that didn't want her there. And lately, something sharper had begun gnawing at her insides, resentment. The cracks in their marriage had grown to the point that even the smallest things could ignite a friction that neither of them could control. Tim, preoccupied with his furniture business and with juggling Lily's needs, always seemed distracted or absent. His late nights at the workshop, the dismissive tone when Emily voiced her frustrations, and his endless patience for Lily, but none for his wife, they were like tiny cuts that never stopped bleeding. Emily, for her part, had grown more withdrawn. The once eager young bride, willing to do everything for her husband and stepdaughter, now moved through their home like a shadow, resentful of her surroundings and of the life she had chosen. One evening, everything came to a head. It started as all their fights did, small, almost inconsequential. Tim had forgotten to get the groceries Emily asked for, instead bringing home takeout because he'd been slammed at work. Normally Emily might have gritted her teeth and let it go, chalking it up to just another thing that wasn't her priority in his life. But not that night. "Really, Tim? One job. You couldn't do one thing I asked you to do," Emily snapped, slamming a plate onto the counter with more force than intended. Tim barely looked up as he set the takeout bags on the table. "Emily, I'm sorry, I forgot. I've got a lot on my plate right now, okay?" "You've always got a lot on your plate," she retorted, her voice trembling with anger. "And somehow I'm never on it." The words hung between them, thick and heavy in the dimly lit kitchen. Tim sighed, running a hand through his hair as if searching for a way out of the conversation. "That's not fair. You know I'm doing my best," he said, his tone already bordering on defensive. Emily let out a bitter laugh, the kind that carried more pain than humor. "Your best? Your best is showing up late every night, ignoring me half the time, and then acting like I should be grateful for the crumbs of attention you throw my way." She stepped closer, her voice growing louder. "Do you even see me anymore, Tim? Or am I just your unpaid babysitter?" Tim's jaw tightened, his patience eroding. Don't make this about Lily," he warned, his voice low but edged with frustration. "But that's exactly what this is about," Emily yelled, her voice breaking. "It's always about Lily. You cater to her every whim, you drop everything for her, and what do I get?" "Nothing. I'm invisible to you, Tim, to both of you." Tim stared at her, disbelief etched across his features. "You think I ignore you? Emily, everything I do, everything is for this family, for us. Do you think it's easy, working all day and coming home to this?" He gestured vaguely, his words cutting deeper than he intended. This? Emily repeated, her face flushing with hurt and anger. "You mean me, right? That's what you meant, Tim. Coming home to me. God forbid your precious little perfect life gets a wrinkle in it because of me." Tim stepped closer, his voice rising now too. "Don't twist my words. You knew what you were signing up for when we got married. You knew Lily came first." "That's just it, Tim," Emily shouted, tears now streaming down her face. "I didn't sign up to come second. I'm not saying I need to come before Lily. I get it, she's your daughter. But do you even know what it feels like to never matter? To never be considered?" Tim shook his head, visibly frustrated. "Emily, I can't do this right now. Not tonight. I'm too tired for this." He turned to leave the kitchen, but her next words stopped him in his tracks. "Well, I'm too tired to pretend anymore," she said, her voice quieter but no less piercing. "Too tired to keep being the only one in this marriage who's trying." Tim stopped in the doorway, his back turned to her. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, but instead he walked out, leaving Emily alone in the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs. Later that night, Emily lay in bed staring up at the ceiling. Tim was on the couch again, the silence between them wider than it had ever been. She recalled her mother's gentle warnings before the wedding. "I just don't want you to feel like you're biting off more than you can chew, sweetheart. Marriage is hard enough without starting with so much weight." Emily had waved it off, confident that love would be enough to get her through anything. But now, in the stillness of the night, love felt so far away, like a distant memory she could hardly recognize. When her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, Emily reached for it instinctively. A text from her mother lit up the screen. "Hey sweetie, just checking in, everything okay?" She stared at the words for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could she say? That her marriage felt like quicksand? That she had given up everything for a family that didn't want her? That some days the loneliness was so thick she felt like she was choking on it? Instead she typed, "I'm fine, Mom, just busy, love you." The lie felt like a betrayal, but then again, Emily realized, her life had become a series of betrayals, of herself, of her dreams, and worst of all, of the love she had once believed was unshakable. As she lay her phone back on the nightstand, Emily turned onto her side, closing her eyes against the wave of despair that had become her nightly companion. But deep inside, she knew things couldn't stay like this for much longer. Something was going to break, and when it did, There would be no going back. The seed of hatred. It didn't happen all at once. Hatred rarely does. It started as something small, something so quiet that Emily didn't even recognize it at first. A small prick of bitterness buried in the relentless, grinding rhythm of her daily life. For months she told herself it was normal to feel overwhelmed, tired, and unappreciated. After all, marriage required sacrifice, didn't it? Every veteran couple she had known back in Marion had warned her as much. "It's a lot of give and take, honey," her Aunt Diane used to say over coffee on Sunday afternoons. But for Emily, it seemed like she gave and gave, while Tim and Lily simply took. The bitterness began to grow into something sharper around the edges after she miscarried. It was supposed to be her chance at becoming a mother, a real mother, not a stepmother who walked on eggshells around a child who would never truly see her as family. She had fantasized about holding her own baby in her arms, a bond untainted by the specter of Tim's first marriage or by years of resentment. But 2 months into her pregnancy, when she began bleeding one morning and rushed herself to the hospital, the doctor's grave expression shattered all those dreams in an instant. The fetus wasn't developing properly, the doctor explained carefully, but Emily didn't hear most of the details. All she could focus on was the hollow ache in her chest and the cold, sterile walls of the hospital room. Tim held her hand, murmuring that it wasn't her fault, that these things happened, but she could see it in his eyes, the disappointment, the silent grief he tried to mask. And when they returned home that evening, Lily's tantrum over a missing puzzle piece was the first sound that greeted her. It was then, in the fog of physical pain and emotional devastation, that the first shadow of hatred began to creep into Emily's heart. She didn't want to admit it at first. She didn't want to name it. After all, what kind of person harbored resentment toward a 5-year-old? But late at night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop the thoughts from surfacing. If Lily weren't here, this would have been easier. At first, she blamed herself. She was the adult, wasn't she? She should have been able to let it go, to navigate her feelings like a responsible grown-up. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, every small moment where she felt unseen, unheard, or sidelined began to take on more weight. There were the mornings when she'd try to make Lily pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, only for the child to refuse to eat because the syrup wasn't poured in the right spot. There were the family outings that Emily had longed for, that always ended in tears or awkward silences because Lily didn't like crowds or because her routines were disrupted. There was the way Tim never seemed to defend Emily when Lily screamed at her or threw things, choosing instead to calmly explain, "It's not her fault. She doesn't understand." What no one seemed to understand was that Emily's pain wasn't just about Lily's behavior, it was about feeling erased. After the miscarriage, the house seemed even quieter, even lonelier, and every sound that Lily made seemed amplified. The clinking of her spoon against her cereal bowl, the sound of her tiny voice asking for Tim and never for Emily, it was like sandpaper against Emily's already raw emotions. She hated herself for it, hated the way her stomach twisted every time Tim chose Lily over her without hesitation. "You're the adult," Emily muttered to herself in the bathroom mirror one morning. Her reflection stared back at her, tired and unfamiliar. "You should be bigger than this." But knowing what she should feel didn't stop the bitterness from growing. Little by little it began to shape Emily's world. It was in the way she avoided making eye contact with Lily when Tim wasn't around. It was in the forced smiles she gave during family dinners, when the child laughed at one of Tim's jokes, and Emily sat silently, feeling like a ghost in her own home. And it was in the dark, hateful thoughts she began to grapple with late at night. By then, resentment had grown into something far darker. Where once there had been hope for connection, for healing, there was now only distance. And with each passing day, Emily's feelings toward Lily shifted from hurt to anger, and from anger to something uglier. She began to see Lily not as a child, but as a symbol of everything she had lost. Lily had Tim's undivided attention, while Emily barely had a sliver of it. Lily had inherited the love and legacy of another mother, while Emily's own chance at motherhood had slipped through her fingers before it could even begin. In Emily's mind, Lily became the reason her life felt so unbearably small. "It's not fair," Emily whispered into the emptiness of their bedroom one night, her tears soaking into the pillowcase. "Why does she get everything, and I get nothing?" Tim didn't see it. How could he? He was too busy balancing work and fatherhood to notice the quiet storm brewing within his wife. But Emily felt it growing inside her, like a weed twisting through her chest, squeezing out any light or warmth that might have been left. She started avoiding Lily when she could. She'd linger in bed in the mornings until Tim shuffled Lily off to school, or she'd immerse herself in half-hearted chores to avoid playing games. The less time she spent with Lily, the less painful the interactions felt, but no matter how hard she tried to avoid her stepdaughter, the resentment only grew stronger with distance. And then there were moments when Emily's anger frightened even herself, times when she'd hear Lily cry out for Tim after a nightmare, and instead of rushing to comfort her, Emily would stay frozen in bed, seething silently. Why does she always get to be the priority? Why doesn't anyone care about me? The seed of hatred had taken root. It twisted her perceptions, altered the way she saw the world and the people around her. It left her feeling powerless, consumed by emotions she couldn't control, not just toward Lily, but toward Tim too. And as that hatred grew, so did a gnawing sense of guilt. You're an awful person, she thought on her darkest days. This isn't who you were supposed to be. But no matter how much she hated herself for it, she couldn't stop the feelings from festering. Slowly the life Emily had dreamed of, the fairy tale she had once believed in, warped into something unrecognizable. And deep down, she had the painful realization that she wasn't just a victim of her circumstances, she was becoming their villain. A horrific crime. The day had started like any other, a mundane Tuesday in late spring with the sunlight streaming weakly through the half-closed blinds of the Parker family kitchen. Emily went about her morning routine with mechanical precision, pouring cereal into Lily's favorite yellow bowl, and meticulously setting the blue spoon beside it, just as the 5-year-old preferred. Lily sat at the table, swinging her feet idly while humming a tune to herself. Tim had already left for work hours earlier, as he always did, vanishing into his world of sawdust and blueprints. Though the house was silent except for the clinking of Lily's cereal spoon, Emily felt like she was suffocating. It wasn't a sudden feeling, it had been building for months, years even. Like a toxin running slow and steady through her veins, agitation had fermented into frustration, frustration into resentment, and finally, an outright hatred so consuming it terrified her. But at the same time she felt numb to it. The hatred wasn't a searing fire, it was cold, paralyzing. All day Emily moved through her tasks like a ghost, laundry, sweeping, tidying up Lily's toys that were always strewn across the living room floor like confetti after a parade. Her mind replayed words, arguments, scenes from her life, as if they were reels of a silent film she couldn't turn off. Lily crying for Tim in the middle of the night. Tim brushing off her needs with his tired excuses. Neighbors whispering about how much Lily missed her real mom. By the time evening rolled around, Emily found herself in the kitchen, staring blankly at the contents of the fridge. There wasn't much left: deli meat, a carton of eggs, and the gallon of milk Tim had hastily tossed in the cart over the weekend. Her hands shook as she grabbed the milk, her breaths growing shallow. Behind her, Lily toddled into the room, clutching her stuffed bunny, her amber eyes, so much like Tim's, flicking upward toward Emily. "Can I have some milk, Mama?" she asked softly. Mama. That word twisted in Emily's chest like a knife. It was rare for Lily to call her that, and when she did, it sounded almost accidental, as if she had momentarily forgotten she wasn't speaking to her birth mother. It should have warmed Emily's heart. Part of her wanted it to. But another part of her, darker and colder, recoiled. Without answering, Emily pulled a clean glass from the cabinet, filling it halfway with milk. Her movements were rigid, stiff, as if every muscle required deliberate control. In that moment all the arguments, all the slights, every ounce of resentment she had bottled up over the years seemed to roar into focus. "Mama!" The word echoed in her mind, ricocheting against the memory of everything she had sacrificed, her family, her youth, her dreams. As Lily leaned her small hands on the counter, waiting for the milk, Emily's eyes drifted toward the small drawer to her left. Her brain felt like it was detached from her body as her fingers reached out and gripped the edge of the drawer, pulling it open. Inside, amongst rubber bands and scissors, was a small bottle of rat poison. Tim had bought it months ago to deal with a pest problem in the shed, tossing it in the drawer and forgetting about it. Her thoughts clouded over in a rush of panic. She didn't know why her hand moved the way it did, why she removed the bottle and unscrewed the cap. Was this hatred? Was it desperation? Was it insanity? Every answer felt valid and utterly inadequate. Her trembling hands tilted the poison bottle over the glass, letting a small amount spill into the milk. She watched as it swirled through the creamy liquid, invisible to the naked eye, and then picked up a spoon to stir it slowly. For a second she almost stopped. Her conscience screamed at her, begging her to put the glass in the sink, to throw it away, to do anything but what she was about to do. And yet, something darker spoke louder. A chilling voice in the back of her mind whispered words she wouldn't remember later. "This will fix everything." "Here you go, sweetie," Emily said, her voice eerily calm as she set the glass down in front of Lily. Lily reached for it eagerly, lifting the glass to her lips and taking a long sip. Emily stood frozen, her breathing shallow and her heart hammering against her ribcage. She told herself that she couldn't stop it now, that it was already done, that maybe things would finally be quiet. But as Lily's small, innocent face lit up with a smile, Emily felt an overwhelming wave of nausea. "Thanks, Mama," Lily chirped, setting the glass back down and clutching her stuffed bunny close. At that moment, Emily wanted to scream. She wanted to grab the glass from Lily's hands and shatter it against the wall, but before she could move, Lily let out a small gasp. "Lily!" Emily's voice cracked, panic swelling in her throat. The little girl's face paled, and she clutched at her stomach, letting out a sudden sharp cry that turned into a cough. She toppled off the stool she was sitting on, collapsing onto the kitchen floor as her small body convulsed. "Lily!" Emily fell to her knees, shaking the child, her voice spiraling into hysteria. "Oh my God, what's wrong?" But deep down, she knew exactly what was wrong. Guilt hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her so fiercely she could barely breathe. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "Please, please hurry!" she screamed into the receiver. "My daughter, she's not breathing!" Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing the lifeless girl to the hospital. Emily followed behind in her car, her fingers white-knuckled against the steering wheel. She prayed, no, begged, that Lily would survive, that the poison hadn't fully worked its way through her tiny body. But it was too late. At the hospital, a nurse placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, her expression kind, yet sorrowful. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, and those words shattered Emily completely. Lily was gone. Emily collapsed into a chair, the weight of her crime hitting her all at once. Her mind replayed Lily's smile, her voice saying "Mama," just before she handed her the glass. It wasn't until that moment that Emily realized the true depth of the love that resided somewhere beneath the hatred. And just as quickly, it was ripped from her, leaving nothing but an unbearable void. The investigation and lingering questions. When the paramedics rushed Lily Parker's lifeless body into the emergency room, the tragedy initially seemed like a heartbreaking accident. A small-town cop who responded to the 911 call noted Emily's frantic demeanor. Her tear-streaked face, trembling hands, and incoherent babbling made it clear she was either in shock or overwhelmed with grief. But the hospital staff, trained to notice specific details in sudden deaths, quickly flagged the case as suspicious. Lily's symptoms, a rapid collapse, convulsions, and respiratory failure, did not line up with typical childhood accidents. Blood tests revealed alarming traces of toxic substances, and the once quiet Parker home soon became the center of a criminal investigation that sent shockwaves through the community. The arrival of law enforcement. It didn't take long for the police to begin asking questions. The first officers on the case weren't from some bustling city task force, but local authorities who knew Tim Parker as the quiet furniture maker from down the street. Many of them had seen Lily at neighborhood barbecues or church fundraisers. Small-town officers with big hearts, a team more familiar with stolen lawnmower reports and teenage speeding tickets than homicides. But even in their inexperience with such heinous crimes, they knew something about this situation didn't sit right. Detectives questioned Emily at the hospital late that same night, trying to piece together the sequence of events. Emily's story started out coherent enough. She described Lily playing with her stuffed bunny, asking for milk, and collapsing suddenly in the kitchen. Her voice wavered when she explained just how fast Lily's condition deteriorated. But the more they pressed, the more erratic Emily's recounting became. Little details shifted. At one point she swore Lily didn't drink anything unusual, but when pressed further she stumbled over her words and hesitated. To the officers her apparent grief seemed real, but the inconsistency set off alarms. "Mrs. Parker, this toxin didn't just appear out of nowhere," one officer eventually said, leaning forward with a quiet but pointed tone. Emily flinched under his gaze. "Are you sure there wasn't an accident in that kitchen? Something you're not telling us?" "I don't know," she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. I gave her milk, that's all I gave her." Interestingly, it was Emily who first mentioned the rat poison. As officers pressed for more details about potential contaminants in the home, her panic spiked. "The shed!" she stammered suddenly, her voice rising in pitch. "Tim bought it! Rat poison! I think it's in the kitchen drawer, I don't know how—" The admission made the detectives exchange a glance. It was rare that a grieving parent voluntarily brought up the presence of poison without prompting, and Emily's fragmented way of offering the information tipped the scale from suspicious to urgent, shifting to the Parker home. Within hours, a search warrant was issued for the Parker residence. Detectives combed over the house, starting with the kitchen. Officers found the bottle of rat poison where Emily had described, tucked alongside scissors, tape, and other odds and ends in the kitchen drawer. A forensic team carefully dusted the bottle for fingerprints, confirming what they already suspected. Emily's prints were all over it. Further searches of the home uncovered more domestic clutter, the remnants of a life that seemed unremarkable on the surface but hinted at tension beneath. Crumpled grocery lists, an unfinished load of laundry abandoned in a basket, letters from Lily's school that spoke of her special needs program and her challenges adapting to transitions, and, most notably, Emily's journal, an unassuming spiral notebook with frayed edges tucked away in the bedroom nightstand. To casual readers it might have looked like a collection of mundane ramblings. But to investigators it painted a disturbing picture of a woman descending into despair. Scattered entries revealed Emily's resentment and loneliness, with stark sentences like, "I don't know if I can take it anymore," and "Lily takes everything from me, even Tim." Though not an outright confession, these hastily scrawled thoughts provided a glimpse into the emotional storm brewing in Emily's mind. The focus tightens on Emily. Meanwhile, Tim Parker was interviewed at length, though detectives quickly ruled him out as a suspect. His alibi was solid. He'd been working at his furniture workshop the entire day, as confirmed by surveillance footage and several co-workers. Tim's heartbreak over losing Lily was palpable, and when detectives asked him about Emily's behavior leading up to that day, his answers were hesitant, conflicted. "She's been struggling," Tim admitted reluctantly. "The last year or so it's been hard for both of us. But I never thought—" He trailed off, his hands trembling as he wiped his eyes. "God, I never thought she'd hurt Lily. That's not Emily. That's not who she is. She loves that girl." Still, his testimony painted a clear picture of a marriage under pressure. Tim recounted Emily's growing distance over time, the arguments, her emotional exhaustion, the occasional flash of bitterness that slipped through when she thought he wasn't paying attention. "She felt like she didn't matter to me," he said quietly. "I tried to show her that she did, but maybe I failed. I don't know." Emily's journal, the forensic evidence, and Tim's account formed the critical pieces detectives needed to build their case. Emily's confession. Interrogations with Emily stretched across multiple days. She shifted between crying hysterically and retreating into long, sullen silences, providing little useful information. Finally, after hours of questioning and presented with mounting evidence, Emily broke, her resolve crumbling in front of the detectives. Sobbing into her hands, she confessed. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she choked out, her tears blurring her words. "I wasn't thinking, I was just angry. Angry at Tim, at myself, at everything. She was there, Lily, and I—" She paused, her chest heaving as her voice cracked. "I just did it. I thought maybe it would make it stop. The resentment, the voices in my head. I don't know why I did it." The confession horrified even the seasoned investigators. Emily's words were raw, naked with guilt and confusion, but they offered no clear answers. There was no grand plan, no malicious forethought, just an impulsive, desperate act fueled by years of suppressed frustration. Lingering questions. The question of why consumed the Parker community long after Emily's arrest. Neighbors who had once waved to her from their front porches now whispered about her behind closed doors. How could a seemingly loving stepmother commit such an unthinkable act? Was this a moment of madness, or the natural culmination of years of emotional neglect and resentment? Psychologists and criminologists weighed in publicly after details of Emily's journal and confession became known. This case is an example of how untreated mental health struggles can spiral into tragedy, one expert told a local news station. Emily Parker wasn't prepared for the emotional toll of stepping into a motherly role, especially amid the unique pressures of caring for a special needs child. The resentment she harbored became toxic, both figuratively and ultimately, literally. Even within the Parker family, questions lingered. Tim's devastation turned inward after Emily's arrest, as he questioned everything he'd missed. "What if I had just paid more attention?" he said through tears during a court interview. "Could any of this have been prevented?" Within the small confines of her jail cell, Emily asked herself the same questions over and over again late into the quiet hours of the night. The shocking confession. After days of tight-lipped interviews and mounting pressure from law enforcement, Emily finally broke during an interrogation late on a humid Friday night. The fluorescent lights of the police station's plain interrogation room buzzed faintly, and Emily sat hunched over the table, her hands pressed against her temples as if she were trying to physically hold herself together. Across from her sat Detective Carla Henson, a seasoned investigator who had unraveled confessions from hardened criminals and broken spirits alike. But nothing had prepared even her for the story Emily was about to tell. When Emily began to speak, her voice trembled, barely audible over the recording equipment that hummed softly in the corner. "You don't understand," she started, her hands trembling against the cold steel of the table. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Her words were fragmented, broken apart by deep, heaving sobs. Detective Henson remained calm but firm, her voice even. "Emily, I need you to tell me what happened. Start from the beginning. We need to understand. Lily deserves the truth." Emily's head shot up, her tear-streaked face full of panic. "The truth?" she said incredulously, her voice cracking. The truth is, I wasn't thinking. I wasn't myself. I loved her. I loved her, Detective. But something inside me—" She shook her head violently as if trying to erase the memory she was about to reveal. "Go on," Henson urged, her tone softer now, though her pen moved steadily across her notepad. "Take your time, but you need to help me understand what was going on in your head that day." Emily leaned back in the chair, her body sagging as if the weight of unspoken guilt had physically drained her. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath shallow. "You think I wanted this? You think I looked at her? I mean, God, she's only 5 and thought about that? I didn't. But that day—" She trailed off, her voice fading into a near whisper. "That day what?" Henson pressed gently. Emily's hands clenched into fists on her lap. Everything. It had been building for so long, the fights with Tim, the loneliness, that damn voice in my head that kept telling me— She stopped, biting her lip until it nearly bled. "Telling you what?" Henson asked, locking eyes with Emily. "That I didn't matter," Emily whispered, barely audible. "That I gave up everything for this family and got nothing in return. That Lily was why my life turned into—" Her words came faster now, tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. "I was mad at Tim, you know? Not her. But every time I saw her, every time I saw Tim smile at her like she was his whole world, it just reminded me of everything I wasn't, everything I'd lost." The detective leaned slightly forward, careful not to interrupt the fragile confession finally starting to emerge. "What happened next, Emily?" Emily's gaze dropped to the table, her finger tapping nervously against the metal as her voice fell quieter. "I remember, she asked for milk. Just milk. Something so simple, and I remember looking at her and thinking how happy she was, how oblivious she was to everything ruining me." Her face crumpled as tears fell heavily onto the tabletop. "I don't know why I thought it would stop the pain. I wasn't thinking. It was like I wasn't even in my body. My hand just grabbed the poison, and then it was in the milk, before I could stop myself." Emily's breathing grew ragged as she buried her face in her hands. "But the second she said, 'Mama,' I wanted to take it back. I would have done anything to take it back." Her voice cracked under the weight of the admission, raw and full of desperation. Detective Henson paused, her usually measured demeanor flickering with a hint of emotion. "Did you know what the poison would do, Emily?" "I didn't care. No, I mean I didn't think about it. I don't know what I was thinking," Emily screamed, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the room. I wasn't angry at her, I wasn't, but—" She stopped, choking on her own words before her voice softened to a whisper. "I wanted the pain to go away. I wanted to feel like somebody saw me, like I mattered." Henson sat back in her chair, letting the confession hang in the suffocating quiet of the interrogation room. Emily sobbed quietly, her face pale and streaked with mascara, as the enormity of her actions seemed to crash down on her again and again. "Emily," Henson said after a long pause, her voice as gentle as it had been all evening, "you're telling me this wasn't premeditated? This wasn't something you planned?" "No!" Emily blurted out, her voice hoarse. "No, I'd never hurt her on purpose, never planned it, it just happened. And now she's gone." Her breath hitched, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "And I can't undo it. I wanted to be her mother. I wanted her to love me the way she loved Tim, but I ruined everything." Henson motioned for a tissue box on the table, sliding it toward Emily, who grasped it with shaking hands. "But you understand, Emily," Henson said carefully, "that you made a choice. No matter how impulsive or how much pain you were in, you still made that choice." Emily nodded through her tears, her face red and swollen. I know, and I hate myself for it. I hate myself more than anyone ever could. Her voice dropped, almost inaudible. I deserve whatever happens to me. Detective Henson wrote one final note before closing her notepad. The confession had been grueling, unfolding over multiple hours, but they finally had what they needed. Emily's words, at times broken, at times rambling, painted a tragic picture of a woman consumed by loneliness, resentment, and mental fragility. But despite her tears and raw emotions, there was no undoing what she had done. As Henson stood to leave the room, she turned briefly toward Emily, who sat slumped over the table, her sobs quieter now, almost hollow. "Emily," she said, her voice steady despite the heaviness of the moment, "truth doesn't change what happened, it doesn't bring Lily back, but telling the truth, it's the least you can do for her now." Emily nodded weakly, her head never lifting from her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Outside the interrogation room, Detective Henson exhaled deeply, her face betraying the exhaustion she felt. She had dealt with confessions before, murderers, thieves, even those who felt no guilt for their crimes. But this was different. And though the case was progressing, even Henson couldn't shake the lingering feeling that this family's tragedy was far from over. The sentence for Emily. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Emily Parker stood, her hands trembling slightly, clutching the edge of the wooden defense table in front of her. Behind her, a packed audience filled the seats. Reporters, community members, old neighbors, people who had no personal connection to the Parker family but had followed the case with an almost morbid fascination. Everyone was waiting to hear the verdict. Emily looked fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Dressed in simple, ill-fitting navy slacks and a sweater provided by the county jail, she looked nothing like the woman Tim Parker had married 2 years before. Her cheeks were hollow, eyes sunken, and her once vibrant auburn hair now appeared lifeless, tied back in a loose ponytail. As the judge prepared to speak, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The months leading up to this moment had been nothing short of grueling, both for Emily and the community that once adored the Parker family. The trial, a community divided. The trial was one of the biggest in the history of Shelby County, North Carolina. What had initially seemed like a tragic accident, a little girl passing away unexpectedly, had quickly unraveled into something unthinkable. When Emily's confession was revealed during the pre-trial hearings, the shockwaves hit the small town hard. Neighbors who had once waved cheerfully to Emily as she watered the flower beds turned cold. Online forums and local news channels were flooded with debates over her motives, her state of mind, and whether she deserved sympathy or outright condemnation. Emily's defense attorney, a state-appointed lawyer named Charles Brennan, had tried to paint her as a deeply troubled woman unraveling under the immense pressure of motherhood, grief after her miscarriage, and isolation within her marriage. "This is not an evil woman," Brennan argued during his opening statement. "This is a broken human being. What happened to Lily Parker was not the product of malice but desperation, a tragic, impulsive act carried out by someone drowning in emotional pain." But the prosecution didn't lean into sympathy. "Desperation does not excuse murder," District Attorney Lisa Hargrove countered in her statement. "Regardless of intent, regardless of how much loneliness or pressure she felt, Emily Parker made a choice, and that choice ended a child's life." For weeks the trial consumed the town. Testimonies were heard from investigators, forensic psychologists, Tim Parker, and even psychiatrists who had evaluated Emily in prison. Her journal, full of raw, haunting entries about resentment, self-loathing, and her struggles to connect with Lily, became a centerpiece of the case. Excerpts were read out loud in court, including one entry written just weeks before Lily's death. "I don't think I can take it anymore. I've given everything I have, and it's never enough. Sometimes I think, if she wasn't here, Tim might finally see me, but then I hate myself for even thinking that." It was damning evidence, though Brennan tried to spin it as proof of her mental instability, rather than intent. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment came when Tim took the stand. His grief was palpable, his voice cracked, his hands trembled, and he often paused to collect himself. "I loved Emily," he said softly, staring toward the floor instead of at her. "I still can't reconcile the woman I married with the woman who did this. I don't think I ever will." Yet when asked directly if he believed Emily deserved leniency, Tim hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "All I know is my daughter is gone, and nothing will fix that." The sentence. The trial lasted for 6 weeks. By the time closing arguments were made, the jury had been given a clear but heavy task to decide Emily Parker's fate. Would she be convicted of first-degree murder, implying premeditation and intent? Or would the jury accept the defense's argument that her actions, while undeniably horrific, were the result of her unraveling mental state, reducing the charge to second-degree murder or even manslaughter? It took the jury 3 days to deliberate. When the foreperson stood to announce the verdict, Emily's heart pounded so violently in her chest she thought it might burst. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Emily Parker, guilty. The words hit Emily like a blow to the chest. She blinked rapidly, staring down at her hands as though she hadn't heard them correctly. Behind her, a gasp rippled through the courtroom. Quiet sobs could be heard from Lily's former kindergarten teacher sitting in the gallery, along with murmurs from others who hadn't truly believed the jury would convict her of such a severe charge. The judge's voice broke through the rising buzz in the room. He looked at Emily with a mixture of pity and gravity. "Mrs. Parker," he began, adjusting his glasses, "the court has found you guilty of first-degree murder under the laws of this state. I understand that your case is one of extraordinary complexity. However, the law does not leave room for emotional justification when it comes to the taking of a life, especially one as innocent as that of a child." He paused, glancing briefly toward the rows of spectators before returning his focus to Emily. "This court hereby sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." There was no audible reaction from Emily. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself on the defense table before slumping back into her chair. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't look at him. She simply stared forward, hollow and unblinking, as though her body was there but her mind had fled somewhere far away. Aftermath and reflection. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded Tim Parker as he exited alongside his lawyer. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed as if he hadn't slept in months. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter called out, thrusting a microphone toward him. Tim hesitated, his lips pressing into a tight line. "Justice was served," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "But there's no victory here. My little girl is still gone." Inside her prison cell, Emily spent nights replaying the trial in her mind. She thought about the pictures of Lily that the prosecution had held up in court, the gap-toothed smile, the messy pigtails, the light in her eyes that Emily hadn't recognized enough when she was alive. She thought about Tim, how he had avoided looking at her throughout the trial. She didn't blame him. She barely recognized herself either. And she thought about the judge's words, about the phrase, "life without the possibility of parole." Though part of her knew she deserved every year, every month, every second of that sentence, another part yearned to scream, "That's not who I am." It was a moment, a horrible, horrible moment. I'm not this person. But the truth was simple. In that one moment, she had become that person. Over time, the headlines moved on. The community found new stories to fixate on, new tragedies to dissect and discuss over coffee. The Parker case faded from the public's memory, but inside those prison walls, Emily knew it would never fade for her. Lily's name remained etched into her soul, along with the lesson taught by one irrevocable choice, a choice that she would carry with her through the walls of her cell and into every single day of her existence. The family completely shattered. When the verdict was read and Emily Parker was sentenced to life in prison without parole, any fragile thread still connecting the Parker family snapped entirely. What had once seemed like a picture-perfect family, a devoted husband, an innocent child, and a soft-spoken woman adjusting to her role as wife and stepmother, was gone. All that remained behind the white picket fence was a gutted shell of a life that no one, not even Tim Parker, could piece back together. For Tim, Lily's death and the revelation of Emily's actions forged a wound so deep that it consumed every aspect of his life. In the days following the sentencing, he couldn't even bring himself to return home. The sight of their house, once a sanctuary, now a crime scene, made his stomach churn. The guilt weighed heavy on him, a suffocating presence that invaded his every thought. He couldn't stop replaying it all in his head, the arguments he'd had with Emily, the nights he worked late and left her alone with Lily, the times she tried to tell him she felt invisible and he brushed it aside. "Maybe if I had just," Tim would start to say to himself, but he never finished the sentence. Co-workers and neighbors offered their condolences, but what could they really say to a man who had lost his daughter in such a way? "I'm so sorry for your loss" felt insufficient. Their pity only served as a harsh reminder that Tim's life had become a tragedy whispered about in grocery store aisles and church prayer circles, the house that wasn't a home. A week after the trial, Tim forced himself to step back into the home he shared with Emily and Lily, though calling it a home now felt wrong. It was quiet, unbearably so, and smelled faintly of old coffee, unopened mail, and memories that no longer belonged in the same room. Lily's toys still littered the living room, exactly where they had been the morning she died. Her tiny shoes sat by the door, scuffed and waiting for her to slip them on. Tim stood in the doorway of Lily's room for nearly an hour that evening, staring at her unmade bed and the stuffed bunny that had been her constant companion. He couldn't bring himself to touch anything, though every fiber of his being screamed to hold on to her things, to preserve the pieces of her life. But the silence of the room was deafening, and at some point words spilled out of him before he could stop them. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Tim sank to his knees, clutching the edge of Lily's bed as tears streamed uncontrollably down his face. For the first time in years he prayed, not for forgiveness, not for comfort, but simply for the strength to breathe through the next day without collapsing under the magnitude of his loss. Emily's shadow. Emily sat alone in her prison cell, the weight of her actions and the reality of her new life pressing down on her like a lead blanket. In her rare moments of sleep, her dreams were haunted by images of Lily, her amber eyes, her toothy laugh, the way she had said "mama" with hesitation just hours before Emily handed her the poisoned glass. Tim refused to see Emily even when she reached out through letters. It wasn't that he hated her, he wasn't even sure his heart had room for hate anymore. It was more that he didn't know what he could possibly say to her. What could a man say to the woman he once loved, the woman who had destroyed the very thing they were both supposed to protect? For Emily the silence was its own kind of punishment. She was cut off from Tim, from the family she had desperately tried to hold together, and from the hope that anyone on the outside might forgive her one day. In one of her letters to Tim she wrote, "I know there's nothing I can say to undo what I've done. I can't bring her back. I can't bring us back, but I still need you to know, I never stopped loving her. I never stopped loving you. Even when I failed, even when I acted out of anger and grief, I loved you both so much it hurt. I hope someday in some way you can find it in your heart to at least remember the version of me you married." The letter arrived months after it was written. Tim read it one night after staring at the envelope for what felt like hours, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. The words rang hollow against the deafening roar of his agony. Leaving Shelby County eventually, Tim made the decision to leave Shelby County entirely. He sold the house, though not without a bitter debate with himself over whether it was the right thing to do. Truthfully, he didn't want to leave Lily behind, but her memory clung too tightly to the walls of that house. In every corner, every hallway, he saw her running, smiling, calling for him. The house wasn't a home, it was a cemetery, and he couldn't keep visiting those graves anymore. The neighbors pitched in to help him pack, though the task was awkward. Tim packed most of Lily's belongings himself, feeling like an intruder in his own daughter's room every time he folded her tiny clothes or dusted off one of her books. The stuffed bunny went in last, tucked into a small box labeled Lily's room. It wasn't just a possession, it was the last real connection to her that Tim could still hold in his hands. Once the house was sold, Tim traveled 2 states over to Kentucky, settling in a small, modest town where no one knew his name, his past, or the tragedy that had followed him. He took on a low-stakes job at a hardware store, spending his days in quiet anonymity. It wasn't peace, not really, but it was better than the endless stares and whispers back home. What was left behind? Back in Shelby County, neighbors occasionally spoke of the Parker family. Some sympathized with Tim, calling him a good man who had been dealt a cruel hand. Others shook their heads in quiet judgment, wondering how he hadn't seen the signs in Emily earlier. And then, there were those who simply wanted to forget the whole thing. The house was bought by a young couple with 2 kids of their own, unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the tragedy it harbored. Over time, Lily's laughter, Emily's muffled cries, and the echoes of a shattered family faded into the walls, replaced by new voices, new stories, new lives. Tim's private grief. Tim didn't remarry, nor did he have more children. It wasn't that he couldn't start over, he simply didn't want to. Lily's memory was too sacred to him, too deeply ingrained in his heart to ever truly let go. He didn't blame Emily for everything. After years of reflection, he understood that he had failed her too, but forgiveness didn't mean he could go back. Occasionally he would drive to a quiet park and sit by the lake, closing his eyes and pretending Lily was still with him. He'd imagine her giggling as she waded her tiny feet into the water, clutching that stuffed bunny she never wanted to be far from. "Dad, look at the ducks," he'd hear her voice in his mind. "They're swimming so fast." And for a moment, just a brief golden moment, Tim would feel whole again. But the moment would pass, as it always did, leaving him with only the ache of what once was and the quiet acceptance that his family had been destroyed in a way that could never be repaired. A wake-up call from tragedy. In the aftermath of the Parker tragedy, as the dust settled and the courtroom emptied, what remained was not just a tale of heartbreak and irreparable loss, but a piercing, unforgettable reminder of the dark corners of human emotion and the consequences of ignoring them. Shelby County, North Carolina was no longer quiet. It had become a community haunted by questions. How had a family disintegrated so completely and so horrifically? Could this have been prevented? Who, if anyone, was really to blame? The story of Emily, Tim, and Lily became more than just a local tragedy. It was a cautionary tale. Just the mention of the Parker family stirred heated discussions in neighborhood potlucks, PTA meetings, and even academic seminars across the country. The case transcended personal grief, transforming into a symbol of the emotional fissures that can tear families apart, and of how society might play a part in preventing similar stories from unfolding in the future. The press and prospective news channels latched onto the story with a ferocious appetite. Headlines alternated between condemning Emily's actions as monstrous and holding her up as a tragic figure undone by the pressures of her life. "Stepmother or monster, Emily Parker's murderous truth," one tabloid blared. "A mother's silent cry for help that no one heard," wrote a more empathetic column in a national magazine. Even buzzier than Emily's confession were the allegations of neglect, not just by her husband or even the local community, but by society itself. Psychologists penned emotional think pieces debating the mental health crisis in America. Podcasters and true crime aficionados dissected every piece of Emily's journal, focusing on the heartbreaking lines, "I gave everything, and I was never enough." To many, Emily wasn't just a villain, she was a reflection of millions of struggling women, unnoticed until it was far too late. Experts were invited onto morning talk shows debating questions like, why are some individuals crushed under the weight of domestic life while others thrive? Could Tim Parker have done more to save his wife from drowning in dark emotions? Should women like Emily, even after committing heinous acts, be punished, or should they be rehabilitated? But these weren't easy questions, and talking about them didn't bring Lily back. Mental health as a silent crisis. One of the most prominent conversations stirred up by the tragedy was the glaring neglect of mental health issues, not only among women, but among caregivers, parents, and individuals facing immense life changes. Emily's story revealed sobering truths. She had clearly been struggling long before Lily's death. Her journal painted a portrait of a woman unraveling, yet no one around her had recognized the warning signs, or perhaps they had noticed but weren't equipped to help. Academics pointed out that Emily's struggles were not unique. A widely shared social media post comparing Emily's experiences to those of overwhelmed mothers and step-parents exploded in popularity, with thousands of comments from women voicing their own struggles. "I see a little bit of myself in Emily," one commenter wrote. "Not the crime, of course, but the feeling of giving until there's nothing left and still being invisible." The tragedy became a rallying cry for better resources for overwhelmed caregivers. Advocacy groups urged the creation of programs that provided therapy and crisis intervention for parents, particularly young mothers, or those raising children with special needs. "Emily's actions were unforgivable," said one psychologist during a televised interview, "but her feelings were heartbreakingly human and preventable. Too often we only notice someone's pain after tragedy strikes." This emerging conversation forced many communities to confront uncomfortable truths about the silent struggles of the people they interacted with daily. Mental health, so often ignored, was finally part of the national dialogue. The overwhelming pressure of parenthood. Another layer to the tragedy was the silent expectations placed on individuals who marry into blended families or step into parental roles unprepared. Emily was barely more than a teenager when she left her small-town life in search of a fairy tale future. Instead, she walked into an emotionally complicated situation, a young woman trying to mother a child who, by all accounts, was still grieving the absence of her birth mother. Experts called for more acknowledgement of the challenges faced by step-parents, urging communities to offer more support and empathy to individuals in roles like Emily's. "It's easy to say she shouldn't have entered that marriage," said a commentator on a talk radio segment days after the trial. "But the fact is, Her inexperience and youth weren't supported by the people around her. Instead of guiding her, society left her adrift. Groups advocating for family support cited the Parker tragedy as evidence of the urgent need for step-parent support networks and training resources. One nonprofit even named its new initiative after Lily Parker, calling it Lily's Voice, which aimed to provide educational programs for blended families to navigate communication and emotional adjustment. The blame game. In Shelby County, however, the tragedy became a focal point for blame rather than reflection. Some residents held Emily solely responsible, condemning her actions as unforgivable. Others turned their judgment toward Tim Parker, accusing him of emotional neglect or charging that his focus on work had kept him blind to his wife's growing desperation. "He was her husband," an anonymous neighbor was quoted as saying in an article. "If he didn't notice her breaking apart, who was supposed to? She's guilty, no doubt, but that house was filled with cracks long before Lily died." Tim, for his part, kept quiet. He didn't appear on television nor speak to reporters after the trial, but Emily's journal entries, read aloud in court, haunted him. "Tim doesn't see me," one entry read. "I'm like a ghost in my own home." For Tim, the weight of those words became a lifelong burden. He began supporting charitable causes in silent tribute to Lily and Emily, never speaking publicly, but quietly funding mental health programs that helped parents handle stress and grief. The unspoken lessons. Emily Parker's actions could never be excused, but her story lingered in the hearts of those who heard it. It became more than just a tragedy. It became a challenge to society. What can communities do to recognize those among them who are silently suffering? How can families be proactive rather than reactive in understanding emotional distress? The Parker family's implosion began long before Lily's glass of poisoned milk. It was born from Emily's feelings of invisibility, the weight of maternal expectation, and the emotional chasms left unaddressed. Small towns like Shelby County began forming parent-led support groups for families struggling under the pressures of caregiving. Churches offered free or subsidized counseling sessions. Schools trained teachers to spot signs of caregiver stress during parent-teacher interactions, hoping to prevent another unspeakable tragedy. A legacy of warning. In the end, the lesson of the Parker family was not simply about one woman's crime or one child's death. It was a stark reflection of the fractures that form in the absence of empathy, communication, and support. While the story would fade from national headlines in time, its echoes remained vivid in the hearts of those who dared to listen. If anything could be salvaged from the wreckage, it was this: in a society so focused on appearances, there needs to be space for vulnerability. For Emily, that space